Today we're going to talk about social skills and social executive functioning.
Welcome to the ADHD Guys podcast with Mike McLeod of Grow Now ADHD and Ryan Wexelblatt of ADHD Dude. Learn about parenting kids with ADHD from two male licensed professionals who specialize in ADHD and executive functions. No fluffy parenting advice, only practical information that will help you help your child.
And I think a good place to start would be, why don't we help parents understand, or whoever is listening, help them understand the difference between social skills and social executive function skills? Because I don't think social executive function skills is a term most people are familiar with.
Exactly. So social skills is sort of in many ways, in my opinion, sort of an older, outdated view. So social skills is the emphasis on external social skills. So we're talking about things like external eye contact, topic maintenance, topic switching, circles of communication, things like that. So things that someone, like an adult sitting in the room, can observe and take data on what they're hearing and seeing with external social skills.
And social executive function skills we would define as the executive function skills used when you're sharing space with other people. I also call them the foundation of social skills, because in order to use, quote, good social skills, that taps into our executive functioning. So really, the way I think about it, Mike, is that all social interactions pretty much are based in executive functioning.
Exactly. Executive functioning, the more we learn about it, it's really the basis of everything. It's the greatest predictor of human success and independence that we have. Executive function is the foundation of all skills and all learning, especially social interactions, which we're also learning how incredibly important it is. It's basically, at this point, we're talking food, water, shelter, relationships. You have to have relationships to live that, to gain that fully independent and successful life.
So we're going to get into, I should say, about different social executive function skills. But I think, Mike, one of the first things we should do is we should help people understand the difference between social executive function challenges in somebody with ADHD and somebody with autism.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is something that so many people, especially really prominent doctors, neuropsychs, and psychiatrists, really aren't aware of. So many people are still looking at ADHD as this attention-based disorder and hyperactivity and inattentiveness. And then when that child with ADHD presents with social skills challenges outside of just, not being able to focus on school, they tend to get these extra diagnoses because they don't know about ADHD being a disorder of executive functioning and social being an aspect of executive functioning.
And Mike, to that point, I want to mention that, I've been in this field 20-something years, and for years, I always saw some kids with ADHD who were misdiagnosed with autism because of their social executive function challenges. However, I have seen an explosion in that in the past few years of clinicians diagnosing kids with autism who have no developmental history of autism, specifically because they're social executive function challenges. And why is this happening? Is because, unfortunately, most clinicians do not understand that kids with ADHD also struggle socially. So the way I describe this, and I'm curious to hear if your description is different, Mike, is that I say, for a kid with ADHD, they have a foundation of social executive function skills. They may be lagging a few years behind, because your executive functioning age when you have ADHD is not consistent with your chronological age. And these social executive function skills may be used inconsistently, but they're there. Whereas somebody with autism may barely have these skills to begin with, and they could be taught them to varying degrees, but they might not even really have a foundation in them. So that's really the difference, in my opinion, between when kids with autism struggle socially versus kids with ADHD. Do you have a different way you talk about this, or?
No, I would say that's spot on. The only thing that I tend to add to that is kids with ADHD, remember, it is a disorder, it is executive functioning developmental disorder. It's all about executive functioning, which at its foundation is nonverbal working memory. So one way to really describe it is that kids with ADHD, because of these significant deficits in nonverbal working memory and visual imagery, don't learn social skills as naturally and organically as neurotypical kids, sort of just naturally just being in there, observing, kids when you're sitting in class and, having one experience one time where you might have turned someone off or made them not want to be around you, and just learning from that one experience and then applying it to the next social situation. So kids with ADHD struggle to not only, number one, gain the skill, but then use the skill again in the next experience.
And Mike, to that point, I also want to bring up that, another big difference is that for individuals with autism, they tend to have what we call context blindness, meaning they have difficulty understanding the context of a situation. So whether that's like something like reading the room, like you talked about, or what I call reading the field, that's another big difference. People with ADHD tend to be able to get context easier than people with autism, in my experience.
Exactly. And another thing that really trips people up is sometimes we see pretty significant hyperfocus with ADHD, and people, attribute that hyperfocus to autism. So with ADHD, we tend to have kids that have a lack of varied experiences, so they'll hyperfocus on the 1, 2, 3 things that they enjoy, that is in their comfort zone, which 9 out of 10 times is screens, YouTube videos, favorite memes, things like that. And they'll hyper-focus on their preferred interests. And there's a lot of really powerful professionals out there that think that hyper-focus is simply an autism trait, when it also happens with ADHD.
That's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. The reason we're bringing this up is because there's going to be a parent listening to this whose child has been misdiagnosed with autism, specifically because of their social challenges. So that's why we really want to clarify this for people. So is there overlap between ADHD and autism? Yes, of course. Is there overlap in some of these social executive function challenges? Of course, because 60% of people with autism also meet the criteria for ADHD. So there is going to be overlap, but we just want to clarify there is a difference in the way somebody with autism versus somebody with ADHD struggles with social executive function skills. So, Mike, let's get into a little bit about talking about the foundational social executive function challenges we see in kids with ADHD. And I think we should start with perspective taking, because for me, that really is the foundation for everything, is the perspective taking piece, which also has to do with the internal dialogue piece, or what I call your brain voice. So why don't you talk a little bit about what perspective taking means and what the internal dialogue has to do with perspective taking?
Sure, of course. Yeah. So when it comes to ADHD, one thing we have to remember is that it is a disorder of self-awareness. So really being totally understanding and being able to perceive your thoughts, your feelings, your likes, your dislikes, your strengths, your needs, and being fully aware of who you are as a person and your thoughts and what you're supposed to do next, and to perceive your environment and understand yourself in place and time. So kids with ADHD struggle to fully be aware of themselves in place and time. So that's themselves. So think about how even more difficult it is for them to understand and be aware of other people's thoughts and feelings when you are in a social interaction with them. So individuals with ADHD struggle with self-awareness and metacognition and self-evaluation, and then adding a social aspect into this, adding another individual, makes it 10 to 15 to 20 to 100 times more difficult. So it's hard for kids with ADHD to understand their own thinking. Now we have to understand somebody else's thinking. So when we're doing something, when we're saying something, when we're interacting with someone, our body language, our facial expressions, what we're talking about, what we're doing, how we're acting, we're putting thoughts and feelings into our communication partners' heads. That's happened in every social interaction ever in the history of the world. We're making people think and feel certain things about us because we are having a social experience together. And being able to understand what types of thoughts and feelings you're putting into people's heads, and also to understand the cause and effect of that. So they're feeling cringy about me because I did that, which is another thing that people with ADHD struggle with, is conditional if-then cause and effect thinking. And at the end of the day, to be successful in a social interaction, to understand all the dynamics, something that's very, the opposite of black and white, true flexibility, unstructured social dialogue. To understand that, we have to have some sort of internal system of checks and balances so we can stay regulated, stay motivated, stay attuned to our partner, continue to give them good thoughts and feelings about us, And the only way to do that is to have an internal, ongoing dialogue with ourselves to stay attuned to that social conversation. And we know that that's the verbal working memory challenges of ADHD that kids really struggle with. So without that internal verbal dialogue, it's very, very hard for them to have a positive and, really, overall meaningful social interaction.
So, Mike, I think we should break this down and help people understand what it looks like at different ages. But before that, I just want to talk about one thing because I want to see if you agree with me or disagree with me about this. In my experience, kids with ADHD do not struggle with facial recognition or recognizing facial expressions, whereas somebody with autism very much can struggle with that. Has that been your experience as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's sadly a major part of their social skills curriculums in many schools is looking at pictures and saying, how does this person feel, when that's not what they're struggling with at all.
Right. That's a great point. So let's talk about how, difficulty with perspective taking and all these different facets of perspective taking you just mentioned. Let's talk about how it presents first in early elementary school. So one of the things I always explain to parents is that, if your child tends to be bossy or controlling in play situations, that's difficulty with perspective taking. And it's difficulty with that internal dialogue of thinking about, are the other kids going to want to do this? Are they going to want to play my way? Because often what happens with kids with ADHD is when they're bossy and controlling, it's because they're not thinking about anybody else's thoughts or feelings. That is not a lack of empathy. It's difficulty with perspective taking. And often what will happen, we see particularly with younger elementary schoolers, and really the entry point where we tend to see this start is around second grade, so age 8, is they sometimes will report that they're being bullied. And why do they say they're being bullied? Well, because other kids aren't playing the way they want. So they see themselves as the victim in the situation because they don't understand that, no, the other kids don't want to play with you because how you're treating them.
100%. And this is, hand in hand, what we see all the time with ADHD are the kids that try to dominate the social play and make it all about themselves because of the lack of perspective taking. Or you have kids that, can't engage in any sort of anything that's competitive because of the inability to self-regulate. So they can't play tag, they can't play Uno, they can't play capture the flag or any sort of game where they'll probably end up cheating because they know that they can't self-regulate through possibly losing that game.
So, Mike, I attribute that, and something we'll talk about, but I attribute that more to the, cognitive flexibility more than perspective taking.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that or no?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So in many ways, it's a little bit of both. It's mostly cognitive flexibility, but that's another thing that, makes kids think they're being bullied because they're playing these competitive games and the other kids are catching on, this kid can't handle competition. He's not emotionally there yet.
So one of the things, Mike, I always want to explain to people is that I tend to see 3 entry points, into when kids with ADHD, when their social executive function challenges really come to the surface. So often the first is second grade. And the reason why is because second grade, so that's approximately, 7, age 8, that's when other kids start to realize that, basically we've been lying to them all these years. So think about the language we use, in preschool or, in kindergarten, we say, okay, friends, we're going to recess now, or okay, friends, right? It's time for math. And, kids really believe that, we're all just friends here. What happens in that age developmentally between 7 and 8 is they start to understand social hierarchy and they start to understand, I like him, she's weird, he's not nice to me. So that's why we tend to see this really come to the surface in second grade a lot. Why don't we talk about, Mike, other things that, parents might be seeing if their child struggles socially in those earlier elementary school grades with, specifically around perspective taking. And then after we're done perspective taking, let's talk about the cognitive flexibility piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes when kids are not developing those social relationships and they're not picking up on perspective taking, this is when some of those behaviors in class might come up. And you tend to see this, I tend to see this, you can tell me if you see something different, is we tend to see the most behaviors, number one, during those really hard classes like math and things like that kids don't like, reading, writing, but then also in the unstructured classes like music and art and things like that, these kids will really go out of their way for attention. And, the one of the big ways that I tend to describe it to parents is, the things that stimulate the ADHD brain. Number one, screens. Number 2, emotional manipulation of parents and getting your parents dysregulated. And number 3, getting a laugh out of somebody at school, getting a laugh out of a peer at school. So we see these kids going to really extreme lengths just to get their peer to laugh. And they could be, hurting their own character, hurting their own reputation, being extra silly. And because of the perspective taking issues, they can't tell if someone's laughing at them or with them. So we tend to see a lot of behaviors coming out around second, third, fourth grade that are, the adults in the room are picking up on it, but the kid is getting stimulated by the laughs, but they're not picking up on, hey, I'm not making friends from these laughs.
Right. The other thing we tend to see is that, a lot of kids with ADHD have a propensity, because of their perspective taking difficulty, to talk at others. So they might, want to talk to another kid about, Minecraft for an hour, but they never ask the other kid questions. They don't show an interest in the other kids. They just have these one-sided conversations. Well, guess what starts to happen as kids get older? Kids don't want to listen to you go on a monologue about Minecraft, so they're going to drift away from you. So what happens with a lot of kids with ADHD? They find that adults will sit there and listen to them ramble on about Minecraft. So they'll tend to gravitate towards, the recess aid instead of playing with the other kids on the playground. Or they will gravitate towards younger kids because younger kids have lower social expectations. So younger kids don't necessarily know that, if you're in third grade, fourth grade, you're not supposed to have a one-sided conversation with somebody about Minecraft. So they will just sit there and go along with it. And also, younger kids look at an older kid as a role model. So that's why kids with ADHD tend to gravitate, kids with ADHD who have these social executive function challenges tend to gravitate towards younger kids or adults, sometimes even older kids. People often think, well, it's just because they're socially immature. It's not that. It's these specific reasons that we're talking about here.
Exactly. And that social immaturity is such an important topic here, is because, what happens as kids get older? They start to be able to do more things away from their parents. So they need less supervision, less chaperones. So they start going out and doing more varied experiences with their friends. This is what boys and girls naturally do as they get older, on that constant quest for independence that, human beings strive for. And then you have these individuals with ADHD that aren't having those experiences because they're, screen addicted, or they're not building their relationships, whatever it may be. And then, these kids are going out and, playing basketball together, playing baseball, playing kickball, riding bikes, going out and doing these really important executive functioning building things. And you have this child with ADHD that's not making relationships, and they wake up, they go to school, they come home, they stay home, and they're stuck there. So they don't have those experiences that are so important. And then this is where you tend to see the middle school kid still obsessed with Minecraft. The middle school kid still obsessed with Fortnite. The 9th, 10th grader still obsessed with Mario. It seems like social immaturity, but it's just due to the lack of social varied experiences.
That's an excellent point. Mike, before we get into middle school, I just wanted to mention the next kind of entry point I see into these social executive function challenges when they really come to the surface. And in my experience, that's 5th grade. So approximately age 10 to 11. I have a saying I always tell parents: the second half of 5th grade is when things start to go south socially for kids. And why is that the second half of 5th grade? Well, I think it's a confluence of a few different things. I think one, as kids are starting to think about middle school, they kind of get more into an adolescent mindset about things. So social expectations kind of go up, and if that's not where you are, well, then you're going to be left behind socially a little bit. 5th grade is also when boys tend to want to be in part of a male peer group, and girls tend to want to be part of a female peer group. That's the other reason why. And then, throw the beginning of puberty into that. And, that's kind of the recipe for why things start to go south socially in 5th grade. If it's not 5th grade, then I see it almost always happen in 6th grade, which is the beginning of middle school, which we're about to talk about.
You are pretty much describing my entire childhood right now, like piece by piece. Social executive functioning was probably my biggest area of need as a kid.
Really?
And this, 100%. The ability to be on the same maturity level of my peers and make friends and keep friends and all those sorts of things was really a real big struggle of mine all throughout elementary, middle, and high school for me. And all of these things are exactly correct. As others start to do more age appropriate things, be more independent, develop cliques, and do all these things with peers, these ADHD kids get left behind to spend so much time on their own, living this sedentary, screen-based lifestyle that's just keeping them more delayed.
So, Mike, I would say, for myself, the biggest age group of parents I hear from for this topic is probably fifth and sixth grade. Is that the
Yeah.
same for you?
Absolutely, because that's when it starts to rear its head. Because, even for a fourth grader, it still feels normal, in air quotes, for the parent, for that kid to, go home and want to be around, want to play video games and want to, do very childish things. But, when fifth grade comes around, this is when, boys and girls finally start to show an interest in each other, and they have crushes, and they're more open, and it's not, boys versus girls cooties and things like that.
Right.
Now, kids start, dating and liking each other and going out and going to the movies without parents, and riding bikes and going to the park and doing things. And, this is when the parents realize, hey, my son's not getting invited to anything. My son is never texting anybody. All my son's friends are on Minecraft and Fortnite, and he's never seeing someone physically.
Or the other thing, Mike, I hear, between fifth and sixth grade at this point is, he had friends, but they seem to have drifted away now that he's in sixth grade.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And a lot of those friends in the past was, yeah, they were his friends, but were they really his friends? Was it more of a fickle kind of just, like you said earlier, we're all friends here kind of mindset. And then as these groups start to develop based on like-minded interests in sports and clubs and things like that, we see these kids not being able to keep up with the dynamics of these individual groups because of the mental rigidity and the lack of flexibility, like you had mentioned.
So the other thing I would say with middle school is, we tend to still see this difficulty with perspective taking a lot. Often what I hear about is, kids, being, coming across like a know-it-all in class or arguing with the teacher, and they're not doing it necessarily to get attention. They're doing it because they're not thinking about, my behavior right now is making my peers uncomfortable.
100%. Yeah. And these are those constant phone calls that the parents are getting from the school of your son was disruptive, your son did this, your son did that. And of course, like I had mentioned earlier in a video I did, that it's very hard for the parents to hold these kids accountable after they get home all these hours later. But, these constant behaviors at school aren't decreasing because it's so stimulating to the ADHD brain for them to get some kind of attention. So just like they get stimulated by negative attention by the parent at home, sometimes they'll get stimulated by telling a classmate to shut up or to distract them or to provoke them when they're sitting there not being stimulated by the teacher's lecture. They will get stimulated by provoking a peer and causing a disruption, which makes the whole entire class get a little fed up with the kid.
Right. And, for many kids, we still see these social executive function challenges go into high school. I will say, often what I see is kids who have struggled with self-regulation, and I don't know if you found this, but I often find eighth grade is the year that a lot of kids, this starts to improve. Maybe I shouldn't say a lot. Maybe I would say, I can't even give it a number, but eighth grade is often when we see things start to improve. However, what I find is, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, because I particularly see this with the kids who come, to my camp, is they get into high school and they've missed out on all these social experiences through middle school. So now they're, a ninth grader, 10th grader, really don't have any meaningful friendships, maybe have some school friends who they talk to in school, but never really talk to outside of school. Sometimes I hear about them making offensive comments, which sometimes they're meant to be funny, or sometimes they just don't understand how they're coming across. I've seen plenty of kids get in trouble for making inappropriate jokes, both in middle school, like typically, eighth grade and then high school. I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with who made a joke about blowing up the school at the lunch table. And, the police show up at their house later that day. And, they were trying to be funny and they weren't thinking about, this is how this could be perceived by somebody else,
And this is a big thing about perspective taking that is kind of hard to talk about. I can't tell you how many young boys with ADHD I've seen such a massive rise in this recently of sort of that shock value language for attention in social environments. So, I've seen ADHD kids, get really extreme politically. So they'll walk around with really extreme political opinions just to get a rise out of people.
Right.
And every once in a while you meet that young boy with ADHD that, will just says really outlandish things, like uses really bad racial slurs and hate language just to get a rise out of people. I've seen a massive rise in teens with ADHD making jokes about like Hitler and things like that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to me how they just and 9/11 jokes and things like that.
Yes.
It's fascinating how how these are catch on to the ADHD brain, because it really feeds into that instant gratification. As soon as you say something, there's going to be a big reaction.
Right. And, Mike, I have a saying also that I say for a lot of kids with ADHD, negative attention, positive attention doesn't matter. Attention is attention to them. Yeah. So the other thing I want to bring up, the piece with perspective taking I tend to see in high school is, I see a lot of kids because they've often missed out on those, social experiences when they were younger. They don't really, when they get into high school, when kids are really developing these new friendships, they don't understand how to cultivate new friendships. So while they might have a school friend they talk to in school, they never reach out to them outside of school. And I think a lot of parents think like, well, that's just how boys are. And I have to explain, when I explain this to kids, that, no, other guys in your grade are reaching out to each other. They're doing things on the weekend, So if you're not showing an interest in other kids, then you're not going to be invited anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is a huge part of executive functioning that is so rarely talked about. And this is a big role of the prefrontal cortex. So, everyone knows the prefrontal cortex is the home of executive functioning. And most people think about the prefrontal cortex of the brain as time management and organization. But it is an absolute social organ. It is crucial for social relationships. And the way Dr. Russell Barkley describes it, one of my favorite descriptions of the prefrontal cortex, is that it's like a giant Excel spreadsheet in your brain of everyone you've met, who's an acquaintance, who's a friend, who's an enemy, who's this, how did they make you feel, how do you make them feel, what did they owe you, what do you owe them? It helps you keep track of all these relationships in sort of like a totem pole-based, list-based thing, where we start to have to, boys especially, you and I, we just had an entire episode talking about boys. Boys need relationships. And this is such an discussed thing where people think, oh, boys don't need to, be vulnerable with a friend or, hang out with a friend or someone they can kind of, chat with. And, boys need someone they can talk to outside of their mom and dad. They need a boy another boy friend, a friend who's a boy, to be able to chat with them and talk about, things that they're not comfortable talking about with adults. But, relationships is an absolute crucial part of male youth development.
100%. And it's sad how many parents are not getting that right now.
Absolutely.
And I think, Mike, the other thing with high school is that, I have seen so many kids who, again, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and, there's just no meaningful friendships there at all. Again, maybe school friends, but they've never learned to show interest in other kids. And they don't know that, basically what they don't know is I have to make myself endearing to somebody else, right? I have to show interest in somebody else because that makes them feel good. And that is one of the big things I teach, in camp and my school year programs, is that you have to show interest in other kids because that's showing them that you want to be friends. If you don't show an interest in somebody else, they're not going to be interested in you. That's the bottom line.
Exactly. And this is why I always say, you and I are neurodiversity affirming therapists. So there you go. That's like what we do. That's exactly it. We're not doing structured external social skills. We're focused on these internal skills. And this is exactly it. And this is something that, I see time and time again with our gifted and twice exceptional population. So, the mom or the dad, they tend to kind of hang their hat on, oh, he's so bright. He has straight A's. His GPA, he's gifted. He gets A+ without studying or reading and things like that. All of that is great. Fine. So IQ is good. GPA is good. But where's the social executive functioning? Where's the social relationships? Where's the meaningful relationships? Time and time again, it's these gifted kids that push their way through high school simply based on GPA and grade, but they go to college and they're gifted. They're twice exceptional, but they sit in their dorm. They can't manage their screen time. They don't want to leave and go make relationships because they've never had social.
Isolated.
Yeah, they're completely socially isolated, and college is a massive failure, and they drop out early. And all that giftedness, where did they get them?
Mike, I want to tell you a story real quick. So last week I was at APSARD, the Medical and Research ADHD conference, and one of the doctors there, I think he was from NYU, he was telling a story about how this family came in to see him, and the father was like, New York hedge fund manager or some, very high paying job like that. And, the kid was at some expensive private school. And, the father's main issue was that, the kid was getting like C's and B's, and he thought he can be getting, A's, A's or something. And what the doctor said to the father was, he said, I'm not worried about your son's grades. What I'm worried about is the fact that he has no social relationships. And he said the father burst out crying. Wow. Because that was the first time anybody ever brought that up. And he knew.
There you go.
Right.
That's exactly it. Your social relationships are a 10,000 times greater predictor of your success in life than your GPA, period.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mike, one of the questions people are going to ask is, does this all go away in adulthood? And here's what we know, that, for many individuals with ADHD, their social executive function skills do improve naturally to varying degrees. There's also, one of the things that we don't really know why is it that some kids with ADHD struggle socially, but others do not? And I think my thing with that is, I think a big thing is your social motivation has a big part of that. And what I have seen is that even with kids with ADHD, if they become dysregulated, if they're, bossy, or they, might get upset or angry easily with other kids, if they're giving in the relationship, if they show other kids that they care about them, that often makes up for, kind of their social faux pas, so to speak.
Awesome. Yeah. And there's also a superficial aspect to it as well. You could have ADHD and struggle with academic executive functioning, but if you have other talents and other skills, so there's a lot of kids with ADHD who are amazing lacrosse players, amazing football players, have really great, like Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, and all those kinds of things. So, those sorts of things tend to be pretty big with social currency. It's sad to say, but being good at sports is pretty important around boys and things like that. Or you could be very good looking, get a lot of female attention. Who knows? But other traits you may have outside of your ADHD can certainly help you socially.
Mike, I have to just say one point to that is I have worked with kids, and I don't know if you have, who are extremely talented athletes, but they never cultivate friendships from their teams.
Of course,
for whatever reason it might be. So I guess I just want to say that, sports or having
it's not
talent and whatever is right. It's not the end all be all. It can certainly help a lot, though. Yeah. So getting back to what we were talking about, for social executive function skills often do improve with brain maturity. But as we know, there are many adults with ADHD who still struggle socially. And I always say to parents, have you ever met an adult with ADHD who comes off as abrasive, right? Or who says offensive things? I tell a story I want to tell you real quick that, when I was still living in New Jersey, I was at the dog park one time, and there was a guy there, never talked to him before. And he makes like an extremely inappropriate joke about his wife that I can't repeat here. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy has ADHD. So then we start talking, and he asked me what I did, for a living. I explained to him, and he said, "Oh, I have ADHD." And I'm like, "Of course you do," because nobody else would ever make an offensive comment like that to a stranger.
There you go. And that's exactly it. So, parents that are kind of, resting their hats on this will just get better with time, think about the adults with ADHD you've met in your life that are struggling socially and say those incredibly inappropriate things where, now more than ever, you can't be doing those things when there's things like digital footprints and things like that.
Right.
So, which, we know a lot of youth with ADHD really get in big trouble with their digital footprints as well and how they present themselves online. That's probably a whole nother episode.
Yeah. Mike, I'm thinking we should probably save the cognitive flexibility piece of social executive functioning to another episode, because I think what we should do is explain to parents what they can do, or teachers, what they can do to help kids develop these skills. Because as we know, kids with ADHD need to be taught in the moment. So let's talk about real quick what doesn't work based on research. So what we know is social skills groups, office and clinic-based social skills groups do not work for kids with ADHD. The research data is very clear on this. Okay. The other thing that we know that doesn't work is, kind of going through a set curriculum in, whatever class in school and saying, this week we're learning turn taking and this week we're learning this. Social skills are not, or social executive function skills are not done, isolated from each other. So you can't teach, turn taking one week or teaching, sharing opinions another week and expect that all to come together. That's not how kids with ADHD learn organically.
That's also very ableist as well.
It's very ableist, you said?
Very.
Why is that?
Because that's exactly what it is. You're teaching kids in a structured curriculum how to engage socially like a neurotypical.
I wanted to talk about the ableist thing and why there's suddenly this pushback about social skills. So let's save that for the end. Yeah.
Yep.
So let's talk about what can be done. So I want to give you some examples. So in my Socially Smarter webinar series, which is part of my membership site, I have some downloadable PDFs in there. I have one called the Clutch to Cringeometer. And I developed that to help teach kids how others' thoughts about them can change basically on the scale based on what they say and do. So, I teach a concept that, you can, somebody could be having what's called clutch thoughts about you, meaning they like you, they feel comfortable around you. However, based on your words and behavior, that can kind of change to, cringy thoughts, meaning they feel uncomfortable around you. Or it could be vice versa. There could be a kid who you don't like, or they give you cringy thoughts, meaning you feel uncomfortable, around them. But then they kind of change their behaviors and start showing you another side of themselves, and you start to feel comfortable around them. So the idea that others' thoughts about us can change, just like our thoughts about other people can change based on what they say and what they do in the context of the situation. So that's, I think, one of the things, Mike, is we have to understand that, teaching perspective taking very much is what we would call context dependent, right? That's why, kind of role-playing, quote, good social skills doesn't work, because every social interaction happens within a context. So, like, Mike, the way you and I are going to talk to each other when we're not on camera is different than the way you and I would talk if there's another professional there who we don't know that well, right?
Correct.
Every social interaction varies with that. The other thing I have in Socially Smarter is I call it the Clutch Neutral Cringy Figure Outer, which is basically a sheet that helps you kind of look at cause and effect of your words and behaviors. So, for instance, we could say, this is what the behavior, either, good behavior, I don't want to say good, I should say, positive behavior or clutch behavior or, cringy behavior. So this was the behavior. This is what others' thoughts were about it. And this is how they responded to it. And this is how they treated you as a result of how they responded to it. Okay. And then how do you feel about how they responded to you? So it's really that cause and effect, or what we would call that if-then thinking, that we can help kids understand in terms of perspective taking, right? It's a sequence of events, which is that's really what if-then thinking is, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think this conversation segues perfectly into, the ADHD parent. So you have a child with ADHD, and that ADHD parent tends to naturally take on so many different roles and wear different hats. So not only are you a parent, you're their educational secretary, and if your child struggles with social executive functioning, you probably think you need to be your child's social coach. And I see this time and time again where parents think that they have to constantly lecture and do various things to help their child socially. So what I always tell parents is that modeling is always a good thing. Like, you can express to your child, with very short and sweet language, how they're making you feel. Are you giving them cringy thoughts or clutch thoughts or whatever it was? How are you making them feel? You can describe it to them like that. But if you are trying to take on the role of your child's social coach and, teach them how to engage, with peers differently, that tends to pretty much always fail.
And particularly if, for instance, like if I had a daughter, I probably wouldn't want to teach my daughter how to interact with other little girls, because I was never a little girl. I don't have that experience,
Correct.
But what we can do is we can teach them a perspective taking piece. And one of the things I want to say is, often when I explain this to parents, they say, well, I tried that and he says, no, you're wrong, or I don't believe it. But of course he says that because he has difficulty with perspective taking. He's not understanding how he's coming across to others. But that doesn't mean you don't explain it, because even just you explaining this in a way that's empathetic, and is not lecturing, they're hearing it. They might not agree with you, but they're hearing it and they're taking it in,
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the other piece is, the importance of teaching this in the moment. So as we know, the ADHD brain lives in the moment, so they need to be taught in the moment. And again, that is why social skills groups are not effective for kids with ADHD, because they're not going to learn, whatever it is 1 week in a social skills group and then generalize that outside of the group 2 weeks later. That's not how the ADHD brain works. This is the same premise as to why individual therapy is not recommended, because kids with ADHD are not going to learn something and then generalize it outside of their time horizon, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. Everything has to be taught in the moment. So in my opinion, the most important people that can help with teaching this are, parents when we are outside in the community, wherever we are. And, teachers can really help with this as well, because teachers can address things in the moment. And, both Mike and I have a tremendous amount of experience teaching this, but, we can only be so many places at once.
Correct.
I think, Mike, we also need to explain to everyone that, there's a lot of people who, run social skills groups or want to be helpful in this. That's great that they want to be helpful. But the reality is a lot of them don't have any training in this,
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, if this is teaching, this is not therapy, so to speak. It's teaching and building executive function skills. And that's how you improve social executive function skills.
100%. It's all about, making sure your child is being put in those situations where there's going to be pushback. So that's your role as the parent, is to sort of persevere through those behaviors. You're the parent, you're the adult, you know what's best for them. They don't know what's best for them. So pushing them into those unique, varied experiences, giving them some of the tools and some of the information, you can do a review with them at the end and front load them with information at the beginning before they enter a social experience. There's so many different things you can do as a parent, but pushing them out of their comfort zone has got to be number one.
So, Mike, I want to talk about the pushing out of their comfort zone more. I want you to talk about that, but first, I want you to talk about what you just said about front loading and explain what front loading would look like for teaching perspective taking.
Of course, yeah. So, we have to remember the core deficit of ADHD is nonverbal working memory and verbal working memory. So ADHD is a disorder of working memory, and working memory is very different from short-term and long-term memory. Working memory is memory that you work with and you use in the moment to help you with what is the task at hand. So kids with ADHD have great difficulty visualizing what a social experience is going to look like. And a lot of this is, past nonverbal working memory and episodic memory. So they're entering a birthday party, they don't visualize what it's going to be like and what they may have to do to engage appropriately, or they're going to a hangout at a friend's house or a sporting event, whatever it may be. They don't take the time to process the information and visualize what it's going to look like before they enter that environment. So what we can do as the adults is we can front load them with information, ask them some declarative-based language questions, some reflexive language-based questions to help elicit language from them about what they think the experience is going to look like and feel like. So they can call on past experiences of, past birthday parties they went to, past sporting events they went to, help them remember it, what they did, what went well, what different, what they saw, what they did, what they feel, and front load them with that information so they can go into it with some level of competence and confidence.
Mike, because we know our audience loves examples, why don't you give some specific examples of what that language can sound like?
Of course. So you're in the car on the way to a birthday party with your son. You can ask yourself, hey, so I'm wondering, whose birthday party is it again? And I'm wondering, what type of birthday party is it? Is it a laser tag birthday, a pizza party, or are they just hanging out at a house? And then, I'm wondering who's going to be there. I'm wondering kind of what everyone's going to be thinking and feeling and doing while they're there. So help them to visualize, ask lots of questions to help them visualize who's going to be there, what they're going to be doing, what's going to be happening. And then you can talk about, you went to a birthday party, 2 months ago, and you came back and, you didn't want to go at first. Then you went, you were happy you went, and you came back talking about how you talked to someone that you didn't think that you were going to talk to, or you really didn't like one of the topics people were talking about, and that kind of made you shut down a little bit. So, take past experiences and use that to give them strength in the moment.
And also, you want to talk about the context of the relationship with the individuals who are going to be there. So we want to talk about, are there going to be kids there who you don't know very well? Okay, so does that mean we might need to, watch our voice volume? Because if these kids who don't know us, if they're not used to how loud we talk, right, we might, that might, be a little intimidating to them, or they might not like that. They might have cringy thoughts. So we have to talk about the relationships of the people who are going to be in the social situation. So
Absolutely.
So to finish up, Mike, let's talk about the comfort zone thing, because I think one thing we absolutely agree on is that in order to help kids build perspective-taking skills, they have to be pushed out of their comfort zone. You're not going to develop perspective-taking skills sitting on Roblox or Fortnite or Minecraft during all your free time. You have to be in real-life social situations with similar-age peers. And one of the things I said in the last episode, I will say again today, is I have seen things like youth group, scouts, whatever type of activity, I've seen that do more for kids with social executive function challenges than any social skills group out there.
Absolutely. So one of the things we have to understand is that social interactions often are hard for kids with ADHD because they're unstructured and they're flexible and they're not so black and white and they're not always in control of what's happening. And these kids tend to create comfort zones of areas where they are in control. And they're in control when they're playing a video game. They're in control when they're on YouTube. They're in control when they're, on the internet, things like that. They're controlling what's happening. And they feel like they're in control when they're in a 3-hour argument with their parents and things like that. So when they have that loss of control, it's hard for them and it could be stressful. It could be anxiety producing and all of those sorts of things. But none of that information I just said means that they shouldn't be in those situations. So just because something is stressful or hard or anxiety producing or not ideal to them and they're uncomfortable actually means that they should have more of those experiences. So teaching kids to persevere through discomfort, persevere through anxiety, they're having a little bit of anxiety before a social experience. We give them the skills to talk back to their anxiety and say, no, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to have fun. And chances are after the experience, they're going to be happy they did it. It's just your role as a parent to persevere through those behaviors and get them out of their comfort zone and have high expectations for them. And at the end of the day, they're going to thank you for it. And you're going to thank yourself that you did it and you didn't let them just sit at home all day playing Minecraft, and you forced them to join clubs and join activities and have social experiences. So by the time they're 18, 19, 20, they're competent in those environments because you took an authoritative stance.
And even if they're not happy with you in the moment, guess what? They will get over it, okay? No feeling lasts forever. And the other thing I want to explain to parents is that, because your child is uncomfortable, that does not mean that you should avoid, as Mike just said, anxiety-producing situations. Because the way we learn to get through anxiety is by putting ourselves in anxiety-producing situations that are safe, obviously, okay? And then realizing anxiety is a temporary feeling. I can overcome this. And when kids learn that, that's what builds their self-confidence. The more you avoid anxiety, the worse anxiety becomes. The more you accommodate that, avoidance of anything uncomfortable, the less resiliency they're going to develop. And again, plenty of research on this around parental accommodation and around anxiety. You cannot accommodate discomfort or anxiety because it will not improve. It'll get worse. And you're really denying your kid an opportunity to build their self-confidence then and their social competency, obviously, because that's what this episode is about.
Absolutely. So, your child being upset with you temporarily, them being temporarily feeling discomfort, them temporarily feeling anxiety, all of those things are not creating long-term trauma. So it's your role as a parent to make sure your child has as many different skills as possible and has a brain that is stimulated by as many different healthy things as possible. So right now we're seeing kids graduate high school and the only thing that stimulates their brain is a screen. If you have an 18, 19, 20-year-old and they're stimulated by social interactions and exercise and meeting new people and learning new things, you have cultivated someone with flexibility and a growth mindset. And we do that outside of the comfort zone, not in it.
And Mike, I want to finish up with something you said that was so important is that, we want kids to have these skills by 18 or 19, because if they haven't had these skills and if they've missed out on all those social experiences, this is going to affect them for a long time. Okay. And I think that's a really important part to end on, that this is about what's going to help them long-term, not just in the, near future.
Yeah. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this happen. Kids that don't gain social competency, they spend their entire, educational journey from first grade to 12th grade, mostly on screens, waking up, going to school, coming home, staying home. And parents use all their money, all their resources, all their time on IEPs and 504s to make sure they get good grades. And then they go to college. They have no social competency. They sit in their room. They're on screens the whole time. Mom and dad aren't there to say, turn the screen off, go to class, go to office hours, go to the library. And they end up dropping out of college, moving home, and they're in the basement back on screens. So all that money and all that work. And I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with and I know of where that happened to them, and they literally had straight A's. They had amazing grades. Amazing grades. Great, AP classes, honors classes, all these different things. But the screen addiction was never dealt with, and social executive functioning was never dealt with. So they go to college, and in college, you're not going to thrive on grades alone. They end up dropping out of college, moving home, and you're right back at square one.
And Mike, the other thing I want to say about that age group as well is I think about how many, guys I've worked with in that 18 to whatever 22-year-old age range, who lacked these social experiences when they were growing up. And now what has happened is, because of their difficulty with perspective taking, they're easily taken advantage of by others. I can't tell you how many guys I've worked with, again, who are, 21, 22, who, girls get them to buy them beer all the time or whatever it is. And they, because they don't understand they're being used, they're being taken advantage of because they didn't develop these skills earlier on. So,
I've also seen that happen a lot with young female adults with ADHD.
Oh yeah.
Where they don't gain the social competency and the social executive functioning. So all of their friends are on Discord. And Discord is an absolute hellhole. If you're really honest, it's a really dangerous place. And I've worked with young adult females with ADHD that lack perspective taking, where let's be honest and blunt, they were on the verge of sex trafficking. It really dangerous stuff, sending thousands of dollars to guys they thought were their boyfriend, but they were just Discord friends. So something, if you have a child with ADHD, make sure they never get on Discord, please.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
So bottom line is you can help your child develop perspective taking skills. Your child's teachers can help them develop this. And if you want more support around this, you can certainly reach out to one of us. I have the social skills playlist at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. And I have the Socially Smarter webinar series, which is part of my membership site, because this is the topic really I'm most passionate about. And Mike, why don't you talk about how you guys do work with this as well at your clinic?
Absolutely. So we run several in-person and virtual social executive functioning groups where, we may have some sort of lesson or work individually with kids on their own individualized social executive functioning goals. And then a lot of it, like we talked about in previous episodes, is all about transfer to the natural environment. So we don't want kids to be in social executive functioning groups for a year, 2 years, 3 years. We want this to be as short a process as possible where they gain the skills and they're transferring over to the natural environment. So we want kids to go from virtual to real life and competent in several social environments. So we allow kids to have a structured hangout as if they were hanging out with peers, whether it's in person or virtual. We really see no difference in terms of how we present it. And it's all about what they can use in the natural environment to help them make friends and keep friends.
All right, Mike, where can we find you?
Yep. So my website is grownowADHD.com and on Instagram at grownowADHD.
And you can find me at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel, and my website is ADHDdude.com.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Mike's practice, Grow Now ADHD, please visit his website at grownowADHD.com. To learn about the services Ryan provides, please visit ADHDdude.com. You can find Mike on Instagram at GrowNowADHD, and you can find Ryan at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. The ADHD Guys podcast and content posted by either Grow Now ADHD or ADHD Dude is presented solely for general informational and educational purposes. The use of information on this podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, licensed mental health professional, or other qualified professional, diagnosis, or treatment. Listeners should not disregard or delay in obtaining professional advice for any medical or mental health condition they or their child may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.